Welcome to The Explainer. I'm so glad you're here with us. If you're a university student diving into postcolonial literature, or honestly, even if you're just someone fascinated by how language shapes power, you are in the exact right place. Today, we're unpacking a truly brilliant postcolonial case study, the life and work of Louise Bennett, affectionately known to many as Miss Lou. Born in Kingston, Jamaica in 1919, she grew up in a colonial world, but she became a poet, a performer, and an absolutely fierce cultural activist who entirely rejected colonial linguistic hierarchies. She took language, which is so often used as a tool of oppression, and turned it into this brilliant, hilarious weapon of resistance.
Okay, so here is our roadmap for today. 1. The radical choice. 2. Windrush and colonial mentality. 3. Spivak and epistemic violence. 4. Humor as strategic resistance. 5. Rhythmic orality versus silent text. And finally, 6. The limits of reversal. We're going to connect the tangible, on-the-ground history of a Jamaican poet to some pretty heavy academic theory. So let's jump right in.
Section 1. The Radical Choice, Defying Linguistic Hierarchies.
Now, we're pulling our source material today from a master's-level university module on post-colonial studies. So yes, we're dealing with some high-level theoretical frameworks here. But don't worry, we're going to break down these complex ideas step by step, making sure the real-world impact is crystal clear.
Think about the world Bennett grew up in. Jamaica was still a British colony, and the colonial language policies created this intense, incredibly damaging psychological hierarchy. You had Standard English, right? The language of power, education, prestige, the law. And then you had Jamaican Creole or patois. From the colonizer's perspective, Creole was entirely marginalized. It was viewed as broken, informal, just fundamentally inferior. I mean, imagine the psychological impact of that. Imagine going to school and being systematically taught to view your own local dialect, your own voice, with shame, while being told you must constantly admire and emulate the superior mother country.
And that context is exactly what makes Bennett's path so radical. She actually went to London to study at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, RADA. She was fully immersed in elite standard British theater training. She could have easily adopted Standard English to get that elite literary approval. But she didn't. Instead, she made a deliberate, radical choice to write and perform using marginalized Afro-Caribbean oral traditions. We're talking Anansi stories, folk songs, community performance. She flat out refused to let her authentic voice be sidelined.
Section 2. Windrush and Colonial Mentality, the Push and Pull.
To really grasp the irony in Bennett's poetry, we have to look at the historical timeline. For over 300 years, Jamaica was under British colonial rule, which created massive economic dependency. Then, fast forward to post-World War II, Britain's infrastructure is devastated and they are facing severe labor shortages. So where do they turn? Their colonies. In 1948, the ship Empire Windrush arrives at Tilbury Docks in England, kicking off this huge migration of the Windrush generation to the metropole. And this complex transitional era stretches all the way until Jamaican independence in 1962.
But you might be wondering, why did so many Jamaicans eagerly pack up and move to a freezing, war-torn Britain? Well, the colonial education system was designed to build exactly that desire. Step 1. Schools centered entirely on British values. Kids were memorizing Shakespeare and reading about English landscapes they'd never even seen. Step 2. Naturally, this marginalized their local Jamaican history and African heritage, which leads to Step 3, the creation of an internalized colonial mentality. These migrants grew up genuinely believing that Britain was the center of modernity and opportunity. They were literally trained to desire the imperial center.
Section 3. Spivak and Epistemic Violence, the Theoretical Lens.
Can the Subaltern speak? I'm just going to drop this famous, deeply provocative question by post-colonial theorist Gayatri Spivak right here. This is our pivot from the historical facts into the deep structural critique.
So who exactly is the subaltern? In Spivak's framework, subaltern refers to groups structurally marginalized within systems of political, economic, and cultural power. They lack access to true institutional representation. What's crucial to understand here is that the Jamaican migrant in Britain is the subaltern. They are highly mobile, right? They're crossing oceans, they're working, they're active. Yet structurally, they remain entirely unequal because of housing discrimination, racial hierarchies, and restrictive immigration policies.
And this ties directly into epistemic violence. It sounds like a heavy academic term, but basically, it's the insidious process where colonial knowledge systems get into your head. It shapes colonized subjects to view their own culture as inferior while completely privileging the colonizer's language. Bennett's work is a direct counterattack to this epistemic violence. By reclaiming everyday Jamaican speech in her poetry, she's boldly proving that Creole is intelligent, it's highly expressive, and it is fully capable of being high literary art.
We also have to touch on hybridity. A postcolonial identity is formed by both local heritage and imperial education. You exist in this tension right between the colony and the empire, and hybridity is actually a massive tool here. Because the Jamaican migrant, and Bennett herself, went through British educational systems, they understand British imperial discourse perfectly. They know the rules, and that intimate knowledge is precisely what allows Bennett to creatively manipulate, satirize, and essentially weaponize that imperial language back against the colonizer.
Section 4. Humor as strategic resistance, the weapon of satire.
Bennett's comedy? It is not just lighthearted entertainment. It's a highly calculated political weapon. Listen to these famous lines from her poem Colonization in Reverse. What a joyful news, Miss Maddie. I feel like my heart gwine bursts. Jamaica people colonizing, England in reverse. She's using grand hyperbole to expose the utter hypocrisy of colonial logic and to mock British panics over immigration. The humor softens the delivery, which actually makes the critique slice so much deeper. Plus, performing this in Creole creates an incredible, instant sense of communal solidarity through shared laughter.
Take a look at this quote. The flow of people reversed, but power structures did not disappear. This gets to the very core of the irony in her poem. For centuries, Britain extracted labor, wealth, and resources from Jamaica. And now, in the post-war era, Jamaicans are symbolically colonizing the mother country by migrating there to work. It is a brilliant, ironic flip of the imperial script.
Section 5. Rhythmic orality versus silent text, reclaiming the page.
There's also this huge tension between text and performance. Think about standard British literary conventions for a second. They're silent, written texts, fixed on the page, locked in standard English, dripping with elite institutional authority. Bennett threw that entire rulebook out the window. Her rhythmic vocal performances were fluid. She used her voice and her body to physically bring marginalized collective community histories into public spaces. She used everyday, authentic Creole. Her poetry wasn't meant to be quietly studied in a dusty library. It was meant to be heard, felt, and shared out loud. And by writing Creole directly into poetic form, by absolutely refusing to translate her work into standard English, she proved that patois is a serious, fully functional language. She elevated subaltern speech right into the center of public cultural space. And you know, this was absolutely essential to shaping a post-independence Jamaican national identity. It completely paved the way for future Caribbean writers like Kamau Brathwaite, who went on to champion what became known as nation language.
Section 6. The limits of reversal, symbolic versus structural change.
Now, we do have to be real about the limits here. Bennett achieved incredible symbolic disruption. She reframed the colonial narrative, she affirmed the dignity of her people, and she sparked massive cultural pride. But material transformation? That's a different story entirely. Even with the reversed flow of migration, there was still persistent economic dependency. Institutional laws went unchanged, and systemic racism in Britain was incredibly harsh. Bennett used the subaltern voice to challenge the narratives brilliantly, but the actual on-the-ground legislative and economic power, that stayed firmly in the hands of the former colonizer.
Which brings us to this unavoidable tension. If the subaltern voice is highly audible, incredibly humorous, and widely celebrated in the culture, but structural inequality remains entirely intact, has the power dynamic truly shifted? Spivak's theory forces us to see that decolonization isn't just an event you can check off a calendar. It's an ongoing, incredibly complex process. Cultural resistance reclaims identity, absolutely, but institutional change, that moves a whole lot slower.
And that leads us to our final thought for this explainer. Empire doesn't simply vanish into thin air just because the direction of migration reverses. So, I want to leave you with this. How do the lingering effects of colonial hierarchies continue to shape the voices, the accents, and the languages that we deem legitimate in our own institutions today? I hope this deep dive has inspired you to start questioning the structures around you. Thank you so much for exploring this with me, and keep asking those big questions.